This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Professor David Starkey on the great noble lie of British race relations.
You have this idea of institutional racism. And the wonderful thing about institutional racism is you don't actually need to have an individual who is racist or a specific act who is racist. In other words, the idea is entirely separable from any demonstrable fact.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to the Daily Sceptic columnist Stephen Tucker on the lefties claiming that climate change is going to make us mentally ill.
There's a new report out which is implying that climate change is not going to destroy the planet externally, it's going to destroy our brains internally. And they claim there are all these kinds of new eco-emotions which many people may just feel are ordinary emotions. Organisations like the UK SHA with this report, they do seem to be creating the mental illnesses that they themselves are supposedly warning about.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of The Sceptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Professor David Starkey. Welcome back for your third appearance, David.
Thank you, and thank you for reinstating my many university chairs that were lost back in 2020. Good to have it done unofficially, if not officially.
Well, you know, you're a professor in my eyes.
But again, this is the problem. We're going to be talking about post-truth. I do actually believe that truth is quite important. Yeah.
Okay, so on that key issue of post-truth, the question we were getting into last time was, of course, the noble lie, and in particular in the story of race relations in Britain over many years. And this was in particular related to the grooming gangs, but I think there are quite a lot of noble lies and half-truths about that story and the history of race relations that we could get into. But let's start with the Stephen Lawrence murder, and in particular the Macpherson inquiry that occurred after that. Because, of course, well, this was a horrible murder, that's for sure, but almost every other aspect of that, there's been a lot of politics involved in manipulating the truth. So, for instance, to start right at the beginning, it's not actually certain that it was a racist murder. I mean, these were very nasty men, it's clear, but they had, for instance, murdered white people before. They were a very violent gang. Then it's also not clear that the fact that the police were initially unable to convict the killers was down to racism, which was, of course, afterwards alleged. And various other elements of this have been woven into this narrative about the deeply racist British society, and indeed, in particular, the institutionally racist police. And that, of course, occurred in the Macpherson Report in 1999. The murder was under a Conservative government in 1992, but this was taken up really in earnest as a social crusade by New Labour from 1997. And I'll leave you with the words of Jack Straw, the then Home Secretary, who really pushed that crusade, which were, "I want the murder to act as a catalyst for permanent and irrevocable change, not just across our public services, but across the whole of society." And yet, in many ways, David, the change that was built on was based on a false narrative.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to pull out the key ideas here. I think and again, to look at the Macpherson inquiry itself. When you look at the Macpherson inquiry, it looks as though it should be the most establishment thing in the world. It is chaired by a distinguished Scottish judge, Sir William Macpherson of that ilk sort of thing. But the key figure in it was an agitator, a priest agitator, John Sentamu, who becomes the Archbishop of York, who was, before he was a priest, he was a lawyer. And it is largely him. I remember debating this. It started to emerge, particularly, as you said, through the 1990s when I was heavily involved in the moral maze, and it was one of the frequent topics of discussion. And we focused on this man, on the invention of, and it is an invention, of the idea of institutional racism. This thing that means that entire bodies, or indeed the whole of British society, because what effectively happened was that the problems with the Metropolitan Police were turned into a kind of analogy or a metaphor for the whole of Britain. And you have this idea of institutional racism. And the wonderful thing, Laurie, about institutional racism is you don't actually need to have an individual who is racist or a specific act who is racist. In other words, the idea is entirely separable from any demonstrable fact. As you pointed out, the facts are and were and remain intensely in dispute. It's also very striking, it seems to me, that the convictions that were finally brought about, remember, above all, this again is very extraordinary, by direct pressure from the Daily Mail under Paul Dacre, and effectively breaking every rule of evidence and every rule of presuming innocence before guilt, with deliberate entrapment of the suspects, of the use of any serious lawyer would have thought was pretty dubiously extracted evidence, and so on. Nevertheless, this entire narrative was constructed, which is independent of fact. In other words, it is manipulable in exactly the same kind of way that Jack Straw spoke about. And this seems to me to be fundamentally and profoundly damaging. What it says is, as is also this notion of irrevocable change, that the idea that we have politicians who see themselves as almost artists, that society is a raw material to be reworked, reshaped into a kind of artistic vision they have. Do you know who were the last lot of politicians who spoke like this? The Hitlers of this world. They were, if you look at it, Hitler is a failed artist. The very close association between him and people like Albert Speer, the architect responsible for the redesigning of Berlin as the capital of the 1,000-year Reich and whatever. And it is this extraordinary notion of the remolding of society by an act of political will, combined, of course, with propaganda. Because that's what we're talking about. We are talking about your noble lie now, used exactly as Plato imagines in the Republic, to communicate an idea of an ideal and idealized society, to mold reality into the desired objective. And interestingly enough, in the Republic, and it's why it's always seemed to me that we should still focus in all our work on politics on those two key texts of Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. In the Republic, the central section is on the role of the political unreality. It's the myth of the cave, in which you have the group of citizens imprisoned in a darkened room who've never seen anything outside it. And what it really is, it's an image of the internet. It is completely extraordinary how 2,500 years ago, present unreality was anticipated, because he imagines manipulated puppets with a fire casting enlarged images on a white wall, and people only familiar with that. And we are in this profoundly dangerous world, it seems to me, in which right, left, and center have all conspired with Plato for often good reasons, sometimes very bad, sometimes in the middle, to ignore reality, to pretend reality doesn't exist. Let's look at another version. You said the whole beginning with the Lawrence Enquiry, but the Lawrence Enquiry comes very, very far down the chronological pattern of the lie, the noble lie. Of course, the original moment when black immigration begins into Britain in any conceivable numbers is Windrush. Windrush is subject to the most preposterous legend. The original people coming on Windrush were immigrants who wanted to better themselves. They were absolutely classic economic migrants. And generally speaking, because in those days, West Indies society was profoundly respectable, the men all arrived in suits and the women arrived in nice dresses, and they were married couples, and it was a very different from the vision of Stormzy. But they came over in just the same way that asylum seekers are doing now, for economic betterment. But instead, we've created this complete myth. They arrived because there were labor shortage. Labor shortages in 1940s Britain? You know, that we had the returning armies. The idea that these people arrived to rebuild Britain, this entire myth of Britain built on immigrants, begins with a self-evident and demonstrable lie. I mean, again, Laurie, there's only one group of people that are indeed immigrants that you could say built Britain, and do you know who it is? It is the Irish labourers of the 19th century who construct the railways, and before that, very often the canals, the extraordinary achievements of Victorian engineering. But of course, they are white, so they don't count. And repeatedly going through, again, of course, with the decision, the catastrophic decision, in my view, to respond to Enoch Powell's admittedly deliberately inflammatory speech by suppression, by saying we mustn't talk about these things. And it's very interesting. I don't know whether you're aware of it. One of the key people bringing direct pressure onto the Prime Minister, onto Edward Heath, was no other than the Lord Heseltine. Heseltine himself has had an absolutely continuous role on, if you like, the extreme left of conservatism, going right back to his beginnings in the late 1960s and 70s. It's very striking. But what I want to argue with you is, argue's the wrong word, what I want to discuss is, this is only part of a much, much bigger problem. I think the problem of unreality, the problem of the political lie, the problem of deliberate untruth extends right across the whole of our politics, on right, left, and centre again, though the focus of it, and once again, I think this needs spelling out very clearly, the point of real origination, it's no accident, you mentioned Jack Straw at the beginning, the point of real origination is the Blair government of 1997 onwards, and particularly the role, as we all know, of Alistair Campbell. Machiavelli is traditionally known as the father of lies. I think Campbell is a modern Machiavelli. He is the father of lies. He institutes lying as not simply the technique of last resort. That's always been true in politics. Remember, there's that wonderful remark of one of our great diplomats back at the beginning of the 17th century, that an ambassador is sent to lie abroad for his country. Lie meaning resident, abroad, but also to lie for his country. So it's always been there. But the idea that not simply the last resort, but the first resort in politics is lying. That is Campbell. That is the world of Blair. But unfortunately, it's permeated everything.
Quite. And while you went back to Machiavelli, let me go back to a line from Shakespeare, actually, that I think is quite significant here. So in Hamlet, at one point, he says, what he muses, really, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And really, I mean, Shakespeare shows that actually, of course, that's not true, and that Hamlet is having bad dreams, and he has to avenge his father, and he can't just sort of descend into relativism in this way, although obviously that's quite persuasive to him at this point. But it seems to me, like our political class believe today, that there's nothing good or bad, but spinning makes it so.
That is absolutely true. Or indeed, there is nothing. Or indeed, there is nothing at all unless it's talked about or invented. And this, I mean, let's just take, because it's very relevant, we are actually in that extraordinary budget period, this weirdest budget that we've ever had in our history. I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves that it's where are we now? We're in 2025. Back in 1947, we had a real economist as Chancellor of the Exchequer. We had Hugh Dalton, a brilliant pupil at Cambridge of the great J.M. Keynes, and then LSE, where he was a lecturer, where he really formulates the whole modern thesis of redistribution, of the importance of avoiding, gap between the very rich and the very poor. This man falls, is instantly dismissed by Attlee effectively on budget day in 1947, because a tiny detail was leaked inadvertently to a journalist a few minutes before the budget. Now, this extraordinary performance that we've had with Rachel Reeves, why is it? What's going on there? Well, there's been a piece in the Times which I find very interesting from somebody who I think, although he's in theory on the right, is in fact fully paid up member of the Campbell School of Politics, Danny Finkelstein, talking about, could the budget have been spun better? Could there be a narrative that made it better? And he speculates how it could be done. She could say, she already had the one story that it was the result of the wickedness and mismanagement of the Tories. She could have another one that it's all about imposing Labour values. She could have another one that it's all about growth. What do all these three things have in common?
Well, they're stories. They don't bear much relation to the facts.
They're not true. They're not true. This budget is, as we all know, is a product of wild economic incompetence, but also of an absurd belief that you can actually, that the state can grow an economy by increasing taxation and spending money on public services as a regular practice. I mean, obviously, Keynes, we've mentioned Keynes. Keynes, at a moment of recession, talks about this as a possibility if you've got mass unemployment and something. This is how you deal with it. We are not in those circumstances. And to normalize this as an idea is insane. You see it again with Rachel Reeves, having come up with a supposed theory called securonomics, in which apparently, if you improve roads and railways, and you look at what this money is being spent on, if you improve roads and railways, which of course will only bear fruit about 10 or 15 years down the line, bearing in mind how slowly we construct these things, somehow it will mysteriously happen. Growth will mysteriously happen. But at the same time, you're throwing vast amounts of money on welfare because Labour backbenchers insist on it. Now, the idea that an economy will grow if you increase taxes hugely, twice, when you promise not to do it at all, if you increase regulation hugely with things like the new Employment Rights Act and so on, when you promise to diminish regulation, by definition, no economic growth will take place. So the narrative is independent of fact. I mean, this is genuinely postmodern. It is this notion that there is your quote from Hamlet being right. It is that absolute relativism of people like Derrida and Foucault, that there is no such thing as fact. It's just a question of power, or it's Humpty Dumpty. In I can never remember this, Alice in Wonderland or Alice Through the Looking Glass, where he says words mean what I want them to mean, neither more nor less. Alice, poor girl, says, "Oh, isn't that very confusing?" He responds, it's extraordinary how much Lewis Carroll anticipates modernity. He responds, it's a question of power. In other words, if I control this notion that if you control the narrative, therefore reality changes. But we all know, of course, it wasn't true. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. Humpty Dumpty was broken. And all the narrative in the world doesn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again anymore, of course. I mean, that's why Lewis Carroll puts those words into his mouth. In other words, he is claiming that he can change fact simply by will, in exactly the same way that Alistair Campbell tried to do it over, for example, weapons of mass destruction, in exactly the same way that Rachel Reeves is trying to do it with the present budget, in exactly the same way, and on a much more extraordinary scale, of course. You have somebody like that ridiculous figure. I think we need to constantly say ridiculous figure of the new Green leader, ex-David Poulden, now Zach Polanski, the former Harley Street hypnotist who persuaded women that if they thought about it enough and paid enough, they would grow from an AA to a DD cup. And the economic policies of the left are of an identical degree of silliness and unreality.
So on that question of the divorce from reality, to stay with the economic side of things for a second, we had this very illuminating cover story in the New Statesman shortly before the budget, which was going after what they call the bond vigilantes. And of course, fair enough, that's an interesting political topic. What do the bond markets think and how do they respond to politics? But it seemed to come as quite a revelation to a lot of lefties and lefty politicians that actually the bond market is not just a sort of number on a screen. It actually does reflect a real thing, which is the confidence in the amount of debt the government has and its ability to pay it. And that there is a base reality to our economic situation that can't be gainsaid by ideas about modern monetary theory.
Oh, it can. Listen to our future Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. We mustn't be in hock to the bond markets. This is Humpty Dumpty. This is wanting to wish reality away. Because, of course, once upon a time, we were relatively insulated from the overseas market for the securities, the so-called gilt-edged securities, because a huge quantity of them were held by our own insurance companies to fund the final salary inflation-proofed pensions that were then common. They have virtually disappeared from the private sector. So the insurance companies no longer need to hold this kind of debt. So instead of it being held, as it were, within the British financial system, it's largely a very large amount. I think about 1/3 is held abroad. Hence, you may remember Mark Carney, the Canadian, bizarrely, who was governor of the Bank of England, saying we depend on the kindness of strangers. But there is this absolute refusal of the left to understand this. This is what is so staggering, Laurie. This is what is so-called modern monetary theory, which says that a country that is a sovereign country, that like ours controls its own currency, can create as much debt as it wants with no economic consequences. That, I think, should be renamed, called the Argentinian theory, because if you do that, you finish up like Peronist Argentina before Milei was elected, with inflation running at 300% per year, if you're lucky. But there's a really much bigger point, Laurie. People on our side encourage this. We did exactly the same. After all, quantitative easing is another form of the magic money tree. Resorted to, it is no accident, by Gordon Brown, leading the world in 2008, so-called solving the financial crisis. And I don't know whether you remember, my old colleague and friend at LSE, Mervyn King, who had become governor of the Bank of England, was reviled at the time for raising a question about it. He talked in rather indirect language. Governors of central banks have to use that sort of indirect language because their words carry so much weight. He talked about moral hazard, the fact that you were buying out companies that should have gone bankrupt, whose shareholders should have suffered, whose boards of directors, frankly, very often should have been in jail. You were buying them out, and you were buying them out from public money. And of course, at the time, it seemed such a wonderfully easy solution. We had a world financial crisis, and somehow we could just magic up endless billions of money. And do you know what? We liked it so much. Those on the right, remember, there was a Conservative government in Britain from 2010 to 2024. We continued doing this throughout because we discovered it was absolutely lovely. Because not only could you magic up as much money as you wanted, you could also have it for nothing. You had virtually zero interest rates. And you know what? I'm coming to the conclusion that somebody, and it's probably not me because I've got too much on, needs to write a book on those years from 2008 to 2022. If you remember, the bubble bursts in 2022. The consequences of in this country of Liz Truss, but more particularly of the COVID bubble, of the extraordinary amounts that we create in Britain, especially create by quantitative easing during COVID. I mean, at least 400 billion, 500 billion. Some said something like half to a third of GDP, just magicked up like that. And this wasn't the left. This wasn't modern monetary theory. This wasn't Varoufakis. They've all got funny names, don't they? This wasn't Varoufakis. This wasn't Polanski. These were allegedly respectable people like George Osborne, like, for heaven's sake, Rishi Sunak, the supposed, centrist, deeply skilled, absolutely impeccable background on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think what we've lived through, Laurie, and you spent a very large part of your life through, is in a world in which, because money could be borrowed for nothing and apparently created with no adverse consequences, I think the whole business of woke, which again is a world in which words have no meaning. I think, in other words, you might, and I'd be interested, I want to put this to you, you're bright and you're profoundly well informed. Am I being far-fetched in seeing a connection between this world in which we magic money and the idea, for example, of transgenderism? The notion in which magically, by saying, I am a woman, I become a woman. Isn't there an extraordinary point of similarity in which we say, that it's wrong that the world was created by whites? Whites are wicked. It's perfectly clear that all the good things in the world were created by blacks, because blacks and browns are good people and whites are bad people. Am I being far-fetched in seeing a very strong interconnecting thread, which is postmodernism, which is the denial of reality, which is the assumption if you have the power and you control the narrative, you control the story, then that's the reality.
No, I don't think you're being far-fetched at all. I think it's a commonplace of ideological leftism that, you mentioned Hitler earlier on, and perhaps he could actually fit into this, but more broadly, I would say that the communists are the ones who would have had the grandiosity of ideology and the belief that human nature and the world itself is completely manipulable by humanity, and that therefore all that is really required to do that is extremely strongly adhered to ideology. So if you can get everyone reading from the same hymn sheet, you can move mountains. And one great example, actually, that we've had discussed recently on this podcast is the Soviet scientist Trofim Lysenko, who was given the job by Stalin to preside over, well, it came to be known as Lysenkoism, but this was basically their attempt to rework traditional Western understandings of agronomy and basically genetics in plants, and to say that it didn't come down to genes, as Mendel had shown, but actually you could completely change the yields of plants and agriculture by what was done to them only within their lifetime. And this was analogous to the way that the Soviet state treated its individual citizens with a view to create the new Soviet man. So anyway, that's a long way of agreeing there.
No. I mean, let's continue on this, Laurie, because I think it is the central theme. But of course, it wasn't started by communism. It started by the French Revolution. The thing that's so different about the French Revolution, everybody, the lazy thinking, and it's particularly dangerous, lazy thinking in America, is that the French Revolution is a continuation of the American one. Nothing could be further from the truth. The American Revolution is barely a revolution at all. It's an extremely effective revolt against Britain and the British Empire, that is true. But the constitution that emerges in America is manifestly grounded in the traditions of Britain and also the traditions, of course, which the colonists had taken with them. The thing that's so surprising about English colonists, and we really are talking about England, is wherever they go, the first thing they do is create self-government. Those people landing inconceivably awful conditions in Massachusetts, the Pilgrims, amongst the first things they do is to sit down solemnly and to say, we are going to set up a representative council. We're going to sort of more or less replicate Westminster in the middle of the wilderness. It's completely extraordinary. So the American Revolution, and again, the Americans keep language, they keep law, they, as you know, they keep imperial measure and have continued to keep imperial measure long after we've been seduced with the French rationalist nonsense of the metric system. But France was completely different. The French Revolution was a genuine attempt at remaking society from the bottom upwards. And of course, the foundation of conservatism in an intellectual sense of the world is the response to that in the marvelous work of Edmund Burke, first in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, in which he points out the profound danger of what you describe, this notion that arbitrarily you can suddenly transform man, human institutions, weights and measures. I mean, the French try not simply to make weights and measures decimal, but to make the days of the week, the hours, the year, the months, complete insanity. And of course, it doesn't fit. And I think that what we on the right need to do is to have our profound awareness of this, which I think we lost. The thing that went so catastrophically wrong with the Conservative Party in 2010, and this is also very strikingly true in America as well, with the Republicans, because of course, as we all know, the relations between Blair and George W. were incredibly intimate, and America has its exact equivalent under the Republicans of Alistair Campbell in the man who's just died, Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney actually talks about the fact, in complete postmodern terms, that reality can be manufactured. He says, we're an empire. The facts are what we make them. And you see, I think, particularly in the invasion of Iraq, the conscious notion we can invent fact. It's perfectly clear that the invasion of Iraq was simply an act of rather childish, in my view, childish vengeance for the terrible attack on the Twin Towers. It was, let's find somebody that we can beat up. But instead, you invent a spurious cause, so-called weapons of mass destruction, and then you invent backwards an even madder aim, which is to make Iraq a modern democratic society. Again, so in other words, the right subscribing to precisely the same preposterous doctrine as communism, that you can remake a society. It's somewhere, as you know, as extraordinarily unpropitious ground for democracy as Iraq could never have been conceived of. I mean, it's a country which had never known, indeed, if it's a country at all, it's something carved out of a series of empires with intensely tribal politics that had only ever known violent dictatorship. And the idea that you could suddenly turn this by invading into a modern liberal democracy. We repeat the error again under the same leadership in Afghanistan. We repeat it again in Libya. This is the right doing this sort of neo-French revolutionary stuff. We're all guilty, and that we need a profound new reckoning. But of course, those most guilty of this are the people who ruled us from 1997 to 2010. I mean, the Blair government did have this ambition. You want to replace the United Kingdom with this supposed unitary national state of Britain. You try to invent British values. You tear apart the structure of politics centered on the Westminster Parliament, which left enormous social independence and cultural independence to Scotland, but united the politics. You tear the politics apart as well. You decide to do something that not even the French Revolution, and it's really important we understand this. I mean, last night I was doing a talk in which I talked about all these kind of things, and there was the inevitable intervention. What about immigration? But of course, this pattern is also fundamental to this sudden eruption of immigration, because there is is he called Andrew Nether? I can't remember, the chap who spilled the beans on rubbing our noses in diversity as that of the actual aim of the Blair government. But what's really striking, I think, is to go back to all the previous attempts at the creation of new societies. The great problem was they couldn't change the people. And you may remember there's a very famous story, and it's one that I'm fond of telling because it carries all kinds of other good jokes in its wake. This is Bertolt Brecht, the licensed, I call him the Ian Hislop of East Germany, the licensed satirist, the one who was allowed to make the little tiny joke within all the accepted boundaries and hugely rewarded and, smothered in laurels and whatever. Anyway, there was the East German Rising. In the early 1950s, and the East German government expressed, its deep disappointment that the German people hadn't enjoyed being liberated as much as they should have done. And you get Bertolt Brecht's very, very clever response, writing to the German government saying, well, the German people were clearly deeply shameful in their behavior. Wouldn't the proper response be, and listen to it carefully, it's this marvelous inversion, shouldn't the government dissolve the people and elect another one? Now, that wonderful turning on its head, which I think is the art of genuinely great satire, unlike Ian Hislop. But so it is genuinely great satire. But what happened under Blair? He did change the people. This radical transformation in Britain from an essentially homogenous white country into one where 30%, where we are now, you will have the facts and figures at your fingertips. What is it? Immigrant first and second generation. It's of the order of 30%, isn't it?
Well, it depends which one you're going by, but the white British population in England is in the mid-70s, I think, and I think it's by 2035 that the first and second generation population is set to be a third. So, yeah.
I mean, it is. So, in other words, I think what we need to understand, Laurie, is that what Blair did in terms of a fantasy of, as Jack Straw talks about, a fantasy of this new. Do you remember that wonderful, the cool Britannia? We were a new country. We all laughed our heads off. But in retrospect, actually, probably Blair succeeded more than any other person, more than the French revolutionaries, more than Stalin, more than Hitler, in genuinely refashioning a country. But of course, refashioning it not into this nirvana, not into this utopia, but into a hideous, distorted parody of its former self. And I think we really do need to understand the appalling consequences we're reaping of this. And of course, the consequences that in 2010, conservatives, remember, conservatism is a profoundly difficult doctrine because it begins in the defeat of the Great Reform Act and Robert Peel's, as it were, endeavor to negotiate with that. And the only conservative politician who has ever come up with the ability to balance old and new in a rational and intellectually convincing way. In other words, to build on the great achievement of Edmund Burke is Benjamin Disraeli, after he brought in the Second Reform Act, that great speech that he gives in Edinburgh. As I always like to point out, I'm doing this, and you two are probably as well, with a glass of water. We have all these modern means of communication. Disraeli and Gladstone give 2-hour speeches without any form of amplification in huge rooms, thousands of people. Admittedly, there are shouters, there are people at the edges sort of passing it on, but it must have been an extraordinary experience. But they are lubricated, in Disraeli's case, with a couple of bottles of brandy. This isn't even gin, it's very sad. But what Disraeli says in 1867 is fascinating, Britain, he says, is a progressive country. Therefore, change is inevitable. He sounds like a Blairite. But then, and that's what's quoted in the dictionaries of quotations. But then what he goes on to say is, the question is, what kind of change? Is it change in accordance with the traditions of the, and customs of the country? This is Burke's good change. Or is it the bad change of abstract, rootless international liberalism, which is the French revolutionary approach, which is the Russian approach, which is the Hitler approach, which was the Blair approach? But unfortunately, in 2010, Cameron decided that what Blair had done was to bring about a new political settlement, and as a good conservative, he should preserve it. And he says from 2005 onwards that he wants, when he's elected leader of the Conservative Party, he wants it to be a modern liberal Conservative Party, which, if you think about it, is an absolute contradiction in terms. And it is the disaster that the Conservatives went along, and indeed it's primarily under their watch that you get this destruction of the value of money, because of course all that money that was created by quantitative easing, it didn't just go away. This is the myth. It went first, because it was essentially, before COVID, was contained within the banking system. It went into the extraordinary inflation of assets, of share prices and of houses. And then with COVID, went through the whole business of Sunak's policies, or furlough and whatever, it went into people's pockets. The moment the restrictions of the lockdown were over, you got this gigantic splurge of unearned money into the economy, which is why inflation peaks under Liz Truss in 2022. This is why, of course, because in reality, you have Rachel Reeves doing exactly the same thing, increasing tax and spending most of it on welfare and increasing the wages of public sector workers whose productivity is zero in terms of the welfare people and very, very low in terms of the public sector. So, of course, inflation continues to be a problem. But the Conservatives consolidated this. The Cameroon Conservatives embedded this. They embodied the unreality and they embedded it. And trying to escape from this is going to be the profoundest, most difficult tasks.
So you mentioned immigration there, and there's obviously the issue of the people coming in and the dissolution or the dissolving, as Bertolt Brecht put it, of the people in that very literal sense. But also to go back to a lesser known part of the Blairite multicultural settlement, in 2000 there was the Parekh Report, which you may recall.
No, I don't. Fill me in.
But so very much fitting with this idea of the infinite malleability of populations, the idea that you can just rewrite history and then create a different future. What this was saying was that we needed to move away from a vision of Britain as a majority and a minority. So, the majority ethnic white British group and then other minorities that were just sort of allowed to be included. But actually we're saying, no, we shouldn't have that. This was a defunct understanding. We had to move towards a Britain as a, quote, community of communities, and indeed.
Sorry, forgive me. No, sorry, I'm not playing a game with you here, Laurie. Who wrote this?
So it's commissioned by the Labour government. His first name escapes me, actually, but it was Parekh, who is, I think, an academic and who's now a Labour peer. But the point is commissioned by the Blair government. It comes in actually with some hostility in the press. People are saying it's outrageous that this report is essentially denouncing Britishness as a racist identity in itself. And so initially it seems like the recommendations are going to be shelved, but actually later they are taken up. And these are essentially earmarking funding for projects that essentially attempt to rewrite history and center minorities throughout British history and things like this, to say, well, we've always been multicultural. Don't you know that?
Which is a lie. Quite. Which takes us back full circle. I mean, this again is fascinating. I mean, as you know, I really am a newcomer to the history of the 20th and 21st centuries, and I suppose one of the reasons that I've been able to do what I have is that that I, heightened by my familiarity with, of course, one of the earlier periods of absolutely fundamental change of the Reformation and the Renaissance period, where in exactly the same way you have this media revolution of printing, precisely corresponding, it seems to me, in its effects with the social media and the internet nowadays, and the profound destabilization resulting from that. But I am taken by surprise. I mean, I was familiar only with one other very remarkable statement, which is the speech in 2003 by Charlie Faulkner, the man who becomes the first Lord Chancellor of the reduced chancellorship and the world of the Supreme Court and all the rest of it that the Blair government engineers, in which he explicitly says in 2003 that it's time that much, if not most, decision-taking was shifted from Parliament. He actually says this. That it's better that it goes to experts, as with the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. Better it goes to lawyers. He was, of course, a lawyer. He would say that, wouldn't he? I hadn't realised that, and this is my ignorance, that they were explicit enough, even to have announced the determination of multiculturalism. That do they actually use the word? They don't use multiculturalism. They use this community of communities. Is that the language?
I think it probably did, but certainly that was the key point anyway. And so the report was by the Runnymede Trust, naturally enough,
yes,
and it was titled The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain. And for instance, that phrase, community of communities, was used by the King himself only a couple of years ago. I mean, this has become very, very central to our official state understanding.
It is it has become the official narrative. I mean, I think what is profound, I find, though I think it's very easy to understand why the monarchy has slipped into this, I think there is a direct connection between all of this and late empire. If you remember, the view of late empire, which is put forward brilliantly by Quentin Hogg in his 1947 little book on conservatism, is that the empire is trusteeship. By definition, all the colonies will become miraculously self-governing dominions, complete with Westminster parliaments, with nice black and brown men sitting there in black robes with, white wigs, and all enforcing Erskine May on an enlightened two-party system, elected by universal franchise, which, as we know, did not quite happen. So I think that liberal view of empire, which received, and again, an incredible rocket boost from 1945. So much of what we're talking about, Laurie, I think, is a consequence. Why do these insane ideas of the French Revolution or of the Russian Revolution, why are they so, despite all the evidence of their profound destructiveness, the fact that we're already seeing France on its Fifth Republic, and the Fifth Republic is clearly not going to survive, I would have thought, more than another 12 or 18 months. Why do we continue doing this? And one of the things, I think, is, one of the reasons that it acquired a kind of rocket booster is 1945, the sense of relief at the end of the Second World War, the awareness that it was a second war of hideous magnitude within half a lifetime. I mean, look, the time is 20 years. Only 20 years between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second, and that determination to try to stop it ever again, and their decision to adopt universal liberal values, which is, of course, the engine of the United Nations, the engine of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so on. And what is profound, what it seems to me to be so extraordinary, you use the instrument that had powered Stalin as supposedly the thing that will guarantee liberty. The complete failure to understand that the proper view is the Burkean view, that that human societies change slowly, that change needs to be carefully handled, that the notion that you can go around and kind of, on special offer, have a kind of constitutional Primark at which you buy this year's latest number, and every society can just wear it. We bought into that rubbish. We repeated that rubbish with George W. Bush and Tony Blair. We repeated it above all with Fukuyama and the end of history. I mean, it's just extraordinary. In other words, this is not just a phenomenon of the left. The left now look washed up because the right is actually beginning to, as it were, come slowly, reluctantly to its senses. But I think, and I think this conversation is part of it, we are undergoing one of those, one hesitates to use words like seismic, it makes you sound very pompous and silly, but I think we are undergoing a genuine shift of how we think about the world, which I hope is, as it were, putting us the right way up after we've had a world turned upside down by this preposterous refusal of fact, this refusal to believe that there are facts, this that wonderful moment of Dr. Johnson disproving Bishop Berkeley by kicking a rock. There's a fact, it's hard, it hits you. Which seems a jolly appropriate moment when we're thinking about a budget, doesn't it?
So to sort of take up that idea again of the social engineering aspect here, the belief that society is like putty in a politician's hand, that they can just remold at will. I mean, you mentioned universalism as a communistic ideology, in many ways opposed to particularism, but this in many ways is what the crusade of the anti-racist state is against, what they would see as racialism, but really just a sense of yourself, of your own race, and of not being infinitely deferent to others in favor of universalism. And so another part of the Blairite post-1997 crusade is the introduction of hate crimes. And what's very interesting about that offense is that they are given this very explicit political and social engineering intent. And just to quote how Baroness Hale describes them in an interesting judgment in 2007, so a disabled man who's on a mobility scooter was going down the street after being at the pub, and he sees some Spanish women or some tourists on the pavement, and they're blocking him. And he gets a bit annoyed about this, and he calls them bloody foreigners, and he tells them to go back home. And he is convicted of a hate crime. But he says to the House of Lords Court of Appeal, well, this was not racism because all he said was that they were foreigners. But Baroness Hale said that it was a hate crime, and that was because the intent of the hate crime laws introduced by Blair was, quote, the mischiefs attacked by the aggravated versions of these offences are racism and xenophobia. And so the point there being that you have the law not just outlawing certain actions, but actually attacking mischiefs, attacking ideas, attacking beliefs, and therefore trying to rework society.
Yeah, and of course, the perfection of hate crime takes place under a conservative government, the non-crime hate incident, where it's not even, you don't even have to have the crime. And again, and perhaps we should be drawing a conclusion on this, the way in which on so many cases that followed the Southport riots, you got judges declaring as a kind of statement of doctrine that we were a multicultural society, and that anything that challenged that was in fact a heresy, which, like real heresy, was a punishable crime. So people are going on at the moment about we mustn't have, Islamophobia. We mustn't have a crime of blasphemy. I think what we're both saying, Laurie, is that this new state has actually created a crime of blasphemy. It's called the hate crime, which is a crime against the noble lie of multiculturalism, or indeed many other things as well. But the whole thing, it all knits together. The fundamental thing is universalism again. The belief, the moment you believe in a thing called universal human rights, you believe in a universal human being being. Therefore, you believe that the nation state is merely provisional and is probably a bad thing, intervening between you now and the utopia of a boundaryless world in which we will all be the same and we will all live together as one huge happy family. And if you remember, it will be Corinthians 14, and the lion will lie down with the lamb, which is actually going to the book of Revelations, but there we are. And as we all know, this is nonsense. This is untrue. This is damning. This is dangerous. And if we're to survive, it's got to be undone.
Quite. And just to toy with that a little more, I've actually just written something for Pimlico Journal on the Race Relations Act, and in particular the stirring up racial hatred offence. But what it seems to me that you have there, because this is in 1965, obviously after 20 years of significant Commonwealth immigration, and this is being brought in by a Labour government who are broadly in favour of this and at least seeming to try and defend it. But what they're writing into law there is this really draconian and broad provision against any kind of language that, as you say, might cut against universalism in some way, lest the public be stirred up to some kind of hatred. But the point that they are actually implicitly making there is that the society this 20 years of immigration has so far created, that they have created, was inherently deeply liable to these kinds of tensions. And yet, from that, they could not draw what might seem the obvious inference, which is that, well, we should stop continuing to create it. And you should say, okay, let's call a halt there, because clearly it's not working very well.
But of course, this is the standard policy, isn't it, of all of these revolutionary regimes we've talked about, of the French, the French Republican state, the French Revolutionary Republican state, of Hitler's Germany, of Stalin's Russia, of course, George Orwell's state. And the compulsion, you will remember, the boot on the human face. That all of these noble ideals fly so much in the face of human nature that the only way you can actually bring them about is by forms of suppression and criminal suppression, which is what we're doing now. And this seems to me to be the profound paradox of all of this stuff. It claims to liberate people, but it can only liberate them by incarcerating them. But once again, we on the right have so often gone along with this sort of stuff. The whole Cameroon, and Theresa May is the one who stands on the steps of Downing Street and talks about burning injustice, burning racial injustice. She's the one who institutionalizes DEI in the civil service, and it's until, in other words, we can only properly tackle this if there is a genuine realization on the right that it is wrong, why it's wrong, and what needs to be done to put it right. The rest is for another debate. But I think until we get that, and I hope we've teased out a few of these points in the last hour or so, but I am increasingly convinced that what has gone wrong is as much on the right as it is on the left. The fact that the Cameronism, and of course the whole world of the neocons in America, all bought into this stuff. This is what's given it its universal purchase. It's got to stop.
Absolutely. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the setting of 1984, Airstrip 1, is actually Britain.
Indeed.
Okay, well, David Starkey, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
A great pleasure.
Now, is climate change going to make us mentally ill? Or is that yet another wild prediction by the climate alarmists, which says rather more about their own mental state than it does about the wider public? Well, to discuss that today, I'm very pleased to welcome back Stephen Tucker, who is a Daily Sceptic columnist and the author of 10 books. Welcome, Stephen.
Hello, thanks for having me on. Good to be here.
Yeah, very good to have you here. So, you've written about this topic this week for us, Stephen. Why are we being told that climate change is going to make us mentally ill?
That's correct. There's a new report out which is implying that climate change is not going to destroy the planet externally. It's going to destroy our brains internally. It's from the UK Health Security Agency. The word security in there just to alarm us even more. when the state wants to make you feel secure, it's generally another means of making you actually feel scared, I think. And they've come up with a new report about the intersection. Intersectionality is always very important to people these days in power positions of authority. The intersection between climate change and mental illness. So climate change is not just a threat to the planet, it's also a health threat now. And they claim there are all these kinds of new eco-emotions, which many people may just feel are ordinary emotions, which have been kind of pathologized. Because there's a new concept out there called not just disease, but a little hyphen in the middle of it called dis-ease.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.